Empires are usually undone by other empires. That is the ordinary arithmetic of power. Something larger arrives, or something equally large tires of waiting, and the thing that seemed permanent turns out to have been only very well defended. It is a comfortable arithmetic because it means that nobody who is not already powerful need feel responsible for anything. Occasionally, the arithmetic fails. Occasionally, what brings down the largest structure of its age is not another structure at all, but a person with no army, no capital, no office, no vote. Because the year is 1902, and she is a woman, sitting in a rented room with a stack of court transcripts and a habit of reading everything to the end. The structure, in this case, controlled roughly 9/10 of the refined oil in the United States. It had been assembled over 30 years by a man who had never lost his temper in public, who kept his own accounts in a small ruled book from the age of 16 until the end of his life, and who believed with complete sincerity that God had given him money in order that he might manage it properly. By the time this story opens, he was the richest human being on earth and quite possibly the most disliked, and neither fact appeared to trouble him in the slightest. The person with the transcripts was called Ida Tarbell. The man was called John Davison Rockefeller. They were born 18 years apart, about 120 miles from one another, into the same rough country of hills and creeks in the northeastern corner of the United States, and the same event made both of their lives. On an August afternoon in 1859, in a shallow well outside a Pennsylvania lumber town called Titusville, a retired railway conductor struck oil. This channel makes documentaries on the great dynasties of old money, the fortunes, the feuds, the long declines. Subscribe if these are the stories you like. New episodes appear every week. What that well did to the Valley of Oil Creek is difficult to exaggerate and easy to picture, because the same thing has happened in every mineral rush in history, and it always looks the same. Within 2 years, the farms along the creek were forests of wooden derricks, standing so close together that a man could cross the valley by walking from platform to platform. The creek itself ran black. The air had a smell that visitors described uniformly and without exaggeration as unbearable. Land that had been worth a few dollars an acre was leased for tens of thousands. Men came in on foot from 3 states, drilled where a diviner told them to drill, and either became rich in a fortnight or lost everything they had brought with them. And a very large number did both in the same year. Into that valley in the second year of the rush came a joiner and part-time schoolteacher from a family of New England stock named Franklin Sumner Tarbell, with his wife Esther, a former schoolmistress, and a small daughter who had been born in a log cabin in a place called Hatch Hollow on the 5th of November, 1857. Franklin Tarbell had spotted something the drillers had not thought about. Oil is a liquid, and liquids must be held. The men on the creek were losing much of what they pumped because there was nothing to put it in. So he built tanks, great wooden cisterns, riveted with iron hoops, each holding hundreds of barrels. And for a few years, he was one of the busiest men in the valley. The family lived first at a place called Rockefeller in a shanty at the bottom of the hills. The child had a black creek at the end of the yard and derricks on every ridge, and on the slope above the house, a strip of woodland that had somehow escaped the drilling, where she collected flowers and later stones and insects and anything else that could be classified. This is a small detail, and it explains a great deal about what she became. Before she was a journalist, she wanted to be a scientist. And the thing she brought to journalism was not indignation, which is common, but the taxonomist's instinct. Collect everything, label everything, and do not draw the conclusion until the specimens are laid out. In 1870, the family moved up the valley to Titusville itself into a proper house. A strange house, in fact, put together out of the timbers of a hotel that Franklin had bought for its lumber when a nearby boomtown collapsed. Titusville by then had an opera house, gas lighting, an academy, and the general conviction that it was the center of a new age. The Tarbells had money for the first time. There was a Christmas with a tree and a velvet cloak for the mother and a fur coat, and the daughter, who was 13, understood, without being told, that this was what a good year looked like. She was to remember it very precisely, because there were not going to be many more. 120 miles west, in Cleveland, a young commission merchant had also been thinking about Oil Creek, and had reached a conclusion that almost nobody else in the business had reached. John Davison Rockefeller was born on the 8th of July, 1839, in a farmhouse at Richford in upstate New York, the second child and eldest son of a woman of formidable piety and a man who is one of the more remarkable minor characters in American history. William Avery Rockefeller sold patent medicines. He traveled the county roads for months at a time, presented himself in towns where he was unknown as a physician specializing in cancers, charged what the traffic would bear, and moved on. He had a second family in another state under another name, which the first family did not learn about for a very long time. He was charming, physically imposing, and entirely without scruple, and he taught his sons commerce as a species of contact sport. There is a story which the old man himself told with satisfaction in his 80s, that the father would cheat his boys in small transactions on purpose to sharpen them. The mother, Eliza, held the household together with religion and thrift, and it was her son, not his father's, who emerged. From the age of 16, the boy kept a small ruled account book. He called it Ledger A, and he kept it framed for the rest of his life, in which he recorded every cent that came in and every cent that went out, including the coins he put in the church plate. He got his first job in Cleveland at 16 as an assistant bookkeeper. He celebrated the anniversary of that hiring every year until he died, more warmly than his own birthday. What separated him from every other young man on the make in Cleveland was a way of seeing. The oil rush was a gamble. Drilling was a lottery. Prices swung by a factor of 10 inside a season, and fortunes were made and destroyed on rumor. Rockefeller looked at all of it and concluded that the money was not in the wells at all. The money was in the narrow places, refining where the product was made usable, and transport where it had to move. Whoever controlled the narrow places would collect from everyone who passed through them, in good years and bad, forever. He went into refining in the middle of the Civil War with a partner and a chemist, bought out the partner in 1865, and on a January day in 1870, incorporated a company with a name chosen for what it promised the customer, Standard Oil. It is important to be fair to him, because the caricature is easy and it is not the interesting story. Standard Oil was, from the beginning, the best-run refining business in the world. He made his own barrels because the coopers overcharged. He bought his own timber because the barrel makers overcharged. He built his own wagons, hired his own chemists, and manufactured a dozen byproducts from the residue that everyone else was pouring into the rivers. He read plant reports the way other men read newspapers. There is a famous instance, and it is not apocryphal, of him asking an engineer why the solder on a can of kerosene used 40 drops and whether it might be done with 39. And the 39 held, and the saving, across the years and the millions of cans, ran into a fortune on its own. He was also, in his private life, exactly what he appeared to be. He taught Sunday school. He did not drink. He married a quiet, intelligent, deeply religious woman named Laura Spellman, whom he had known since school, and stayed married to her for half a century. He tithed from his first wage as a clerk and went on giving, at increasing scale, for 80 years. Nothing in the record suggests any of this was performance. The household he built is worth a moment because it is the other half of the man, and because it produced consequences that outlasted the oil. Laura Spellman had been the top of her class and had given a graduation address on the education of women. She came from an abolitionist family in Ohio whose house had been a stop on the Underground Railroad. She kept ledgers for her children as her husband kept them for himself, and the children were raised in a manner that the newspapers of the 1890s found almost comic. One bicycle between the 4 daughters and the son, chores paid at a fixed rate, a penny fine for lateness at breakfast, no dancing, no cards, no theater. The boy, John Jr., grew up nervous, dutiful, and painfully conscientious, and it was he who would spend the next half-century turning the money into institutions, and his wife, an Aldrich of Rhode Island, who would spend a good part of it on modern paintings that her husband could not bear to look at. That is a story for another film. What matters here is that the man Ida Tarbell would spend 5 years describing as a machine for accumulation was, in his own house, a mild and slightly comic figure who liked hymns, blindfolded games with his grandchildren, and being read to in the evening. And beside it, running in perfect parallel and without any apparent friction inside the man, was a method of dealing with competitors that his own country would eventually decide to make illegal. The method turned on the railroads. Oil had to be shipped, and shipping was competitive between the lines, which meant the lines could be played against each other. Rockefeller shipped more oil than anyone and shipped it in regular, predictable volumes, which was worth a great deal to a railroad. So he asked for, and got, a secret rebate. A portion of the published freight rate returned to him after payment. His costs fell below everyone else's, invisibly, in a way no competitor could match because no competitor knew the number. Then, in the winter of 1871, he and the presidents of 3 railroads went one step further, and that step is the reason the girl in Titusville grew up into the woman who destroyed him. The instrument was a dormant Pennsylvania corporation with a charter so loosely drawn that it could do almost anything, and a name that gave nothing away, the South Improvement Company. The arrangement inside it worked like this. A small group of large refiners, of whom Rockefeller was much the largest, agreed with the 3 trunk railroads that freight rates on oil would be roughly doubled. Members of the company would then receive back, in secret, about half of what they had paid. That much was a rebate, and rebates were already common. The second clause was not common, and when it became public, it produced something close to insurrection in the oil region. The members would also receive a payment on every barrel shipped by refiners who were not members. Read that again, because it is the hinge of the whole story. A man in Titusville who shipped a barrel of his own oil on a public railway at a rate he had no power to negotiate would pay a portion of that freight into the pocket of the competitor who was trying to destroy him. He would be funding, out of his own sales, the machine that would end him. There was no way to compete against it and no way to appeal, because the contract was secret and its existence was denied. It did not stay secret. In February 1872, a freight agent's clerk let the new rate schedule slip, and within days the Valley of Oil Creek was in a condition that the newspapers of the time described as war. 3,000 men filled a hall in Titusville. There were torch-lit processions and effigies. Producers signed pledges not to sell a barrel to any member of the scheme. Delegations went to Harrisburg and to Washington. And in April, for the company had shipped a single barrel under its charter, the Pennsylvania legislature repealed it. The independents believed they had won. What had actually happened in the 6 weeks while the fight was going on was that Rockefeller had walked into the offices of his 26 competitors in Cleveland and offered to buy them one after another on the understanding that the alternative was the freight schedule. 22 of them sold. Some sold for cash, some for standard oil stock, and the ones who took the stock, a fact which every account of this ought to include and most do not, became extremely rich. The men who refused, or who were not offered enough to make refusing foolish, went on refining at a cost structure that could not survive. In the oil region, they gave it a name that stuck, the Cleveland Massacre. Franklin Tarbell would not sell. He had signed the pledge with the other producers, and he kept it, and he went on independently for the rest of his working life, and it cost him everything he had built. He mortgaged the family house in Titusville to meet his company's obligations. His business partner did not survive the collapse. Franklin took on the man's debts as well and paid them off over years. His daughter was 14 years old, and what she noticed was not the economics. What she noticed was her father at the supper table. She wrote about it half a century later in her memoir, and the passage is one of the most quoted things she ever produced. She described a house that had been cheerful and became suspicious. Men in the parlor with grim faces, the sudden shift in a whole town from confidence to a kind of curdled watchfulness. Something was born in her in those years, she said, and she gave it a name, a hatred of privilege of any sort. That is worth pausing on, because it defines the shape of everything she later did, and it explains the one thing about her that puzzles modern readers. She did not become a socialist. She never argued that large enterprise was wrong, or that wealth was theft, or that the oil business should belong to the public. What she objected to, with a steadiness that lasted 60 years, was the secret advantage, the arrangement that a man could not see could not match, and could not appeal. She thought a fair fight in the open was the whole of morality in business. She thought Standard Oil had never once had one. The 70s bear her out, and they are worth following because they are the years in which the machine reached its finished form. Having taken Cleveland, Rockefeller took Pittsburgh, then Philadelphia, then the New York refiners, mostly by the same method and mostly without anybody outside the trade noticing that it had happened. He did it quietly. Acquired firms kept their old names and their older letterheads and went on writing to customers as though nothing had changed, and their proprietors, now shareholders, said nothing because their contracts required silence. By the end of the decade, a buyer in a small American town could choose between 4 suppliers of kerosene and be dealing, in every case, with the same company. The independents in the oil region understood what was happening and fought it with real ingenuity. They formed producers' associations and agreed to shut in their wells to force the price up. And the agreements collapsed, as such agreements always do, because there is always one man who sells. They went to the courts of Pennsylvania, and in 1879 a grand jury indicted 9 officials of the company, Rockefeller among them, for conspiracy to secure a monopoly and to injure the trade of competitors. An extraordinary thing to have happened, and a thing that quietly went nowhere, as extradition was refused and the matter was settled out of public view. And then they tried the one idea that might genuinely have worked. If the railroads were the choke point, the answer was not to petition the railroads. The answer was to go around them. A group of independents led by a man named Byron Benson proposed to build a pipeline over the Allegheny Mountains, 100-odd miles of 6-inch wrought iron pumped uphill against gravity across ridges to reach a railway that Standard did not control. Every engineer of standing said it could not be done. Oil had never been moved more than a few miles by pipe. They built it in the winter of 1879, and it worked, and it is one of the genuinely heroic episodes in American industrial history. A monopoly beaten, briefly, by better engineering. What happened next is the whole story in miniature. Standard could not stop the pipe, so it attacked everything around it. Farmers along the route were warned about the dangers to their land. The railway that Standard did control refused to let the new line cross its tracks. Credit was made difficult. A stockholder was found to bring a suit for the appointment of a receiver. And within 4 years, the Independence Great Pipeline had entered a pooling arrangement with the company it had been built to defeat. And Standard was laying thousands of miles of pipe of its own, and the choke point had simply moved from the railway to the pipeline, where the company now sat. The legal problem remained. Standard was an Ohio corporation, and Ohio law did not permit an Ohio corporation to own companies in other states. What the company actually had was a sprawl of firms in a dozen jurisdictions, held together by personal understandings and by shares parked in the names of employees, an arrangement that worked but could not be administered. On the 2nd of January, 1882, the lawyers produced the solution, and it is the reason the whole class of them is named after it. The shareholders of 40-odd companies exchanged their stock for certificates in a single body of 9 trustees who would run the lot as one enterprise and distribute the profits in proportion. It was called the Standard Oil Trust, and it was the first of its kind in America, and within a decade the sugar men, the whiskey men, the cottonseed men, and the lead men had all copied it. 10 years later, an Ohio court ordered it dissolved. The company complied by moving its legal home to New Jersey, which had just amended its law to allow one corporation to own the shares of others, and reassembled itself there as a holding company. The same men, the same properties, a different envelope. That was the state of things when a woman in her middle 40s, sitting in New York, was given 3 articles to write. Titusville declined slowly after the oil war, in the way boomtowns do, not dramatically, just fewer men each year, and the good years always in the past tense. The family stayed, and the shape of what happened to them is the shape of what happened to several thousand households in that valley. Franklin went on producing at a scale that got smaller each decade, in a business where the price he received was set by men he would never meet, and he did it until he was too old to do it, and he died in 1905, in the year his daughter's book appeared. The great oil fields moved on to Ohio, then to Texas, then out of the country altogether. The wooden derricks came down or fell down. The creek eventually ran clear. By the time Ida Tarbell was famous, the town she had grown up in was a quiet place of about 8,000 people with a good library and an unusually strong sense of having once been at the center of the world. She went back all her life. She is buried there. And in 1876, from that house, she made the decision that was the most conspicuous thing an unmarried young woman in a small Pennsylvania town could do. She went to college. Allegheny College stood 30 miles away at Meadville. It had opened its doors to women a few years before, without enthusiasm. And in the autumn that Ida Tarbell arrived, she was the only woman in a freshman class of about 40. She has left an account of walking into the first lecture and of the sound the room made. It was not hostility exactly. It was the noise of 40 young men discovering that the arrangement they had expected was not the arrangement they had got. And then, over the following weeks, the more insidious problem. They were charming to her. They asked her to walk out. They treated her presence as a social event rather than an academic one, and she understood with the precision that would characterize her for the rest of her life that this was the more effective way of removing a woman from a lecture hall than shouting at her. She studied biology. She wanted a microscope more than she wanted anything else in the world and got one, and spent her happiest undergraduate hours over pond water. She took the degree in 1880 and the master's 3 years later, and she had by then made a private decision which she kept for 64 years. She would not marry. She wrote about it plainly, without romance and without bitterness. She had prayed about it as a girl and concluded that a husband would take the work, and that she wanted the work more. In the 1880s, that was not a life plan so much as a category error. Almost every woman of her class who wanted a profession made the same calculation, because the alternative did not exist. What distinguishes Tarbell is only that she wrote the calculation down. What followed was 10 years of the unglamorous middle. She taught at a seminary in Poland, Ohio for $500 a year, carrying an impossible timetable: Greek, Latin, French, German, mathematics, geology, botany, and resigned after 2 years with her health damaged. She came home, and she took a position that would, in the ordinary course of things, have been the whole of her career: staff writer, then annotator, and effectively deputy editor, at a magazine in Meadville published for the Chautauqua Home Study Movement. 8 years. Correspondence courses, uplift, improving articles for the self-educating middle class of small-town America. She learned to write clean expository prose to a deadline and to check a fact before printing it, which in the American magazine trade of the 1880s made her a rare animal. And at 33, she was still living in her parents' town, unmarried, on a small salary, with the specific and unfashionable ambition of writing a serious biography of a woman. So she did the thing that people do at 33 when they can see the rest of their lives laid out. In 1891, she took her savings, a few $100s, and moved to Paris. She had a plan, and it was a good one. She would enroll at the Sorbonne and the Collège de France, read in the archives for a life of Madame Roland, a woman of the French Revolution who had held a salon, written a memoir and gone to the guillotine, and support herself by selling articles about French life to American newspapers at a few dollars a column. She lived on the left bank in rooms shared with 3 other American women, in a poverty which she described afterwards with obvious pleasure, and she worked. The archives suited her exactly. She liked the physical business of manuscripts, the cross-checking, the long, slow accumulation. Her sketches of Paris sold, and her thinking about Madame Roland turned, over 3 years, in a direction that surprised her. The more she read, the less she admired her subject, and the more interested she became in the gap between a person's public legend and the documents they had actually left. That is the whole of Tarbell's method, arrived at in a Paris reading room, several years before she had any idea what it would be used on. One morning in the summer of 1892, a man knocked at the door of the flat and announced that he was Samuel McClure, that he was about to found a magazine in New York, that he had read her work, and that he had come to hire her. Samuel McClure was an Irish immigrant who had arrived in America as a boy with nothing, worked his way through college, and possessed the most reliable instinct in American publishing for what an ordinary reader would actually pick up. He was also, by every account including the affectionate ones, exhausting. A man of enormous enthusiasms and no capacity to hold still, who would arrive from a transatlantic crossing with 11 new ideas, commission all of them, and disappear. Periodically he collapsed and was sent abroad to rest. What he had understood was a simple commercial fact. The good American magazines cost 35 cents, which meant they were read by the prosperous. He would sell his for 15, take the loss on the cover price, and make it back on advertising and volume. To do that, he needed writers who could make serious subjects unputdownable, and he was prepared to pay them properly and give them months to work, which at the time, almost nobody did. Tarbell's first great success for him was Napoleon. It was a rush job, assembled around a collection of portraits that McClure had acquired, and it doubled the magazine's circulation. Her second was Abraham Lincoln, and that one made her. The Lincoln Project is the part of her career that gets forgotten, and it should not, because it was the training. The received wisdom was that everything about Lincoln had already been gathered by the men who had known him. Tarbell simply went and looked. She traveled to Kentucky and Illinois, interviewed people who had never been asked, neighbors, a stepmother's relations, courthouse clerks, and turned up documents nobody had thought to check, including material on the family's early years that professional historians had assumed lost. The series ran for years. Circulation went past 250,000. She became, in the last decade of the 19th century, one of the best-known writers in the United States, and the one that editors trusted when a subject was large. She was in her early 40s, financially independent for the first time, living in New York and looking for the next thing. And in the editorial conferences at McClure's in the last months of the old century, the next thing kept presenting itself in a single word: the trusts. It is difficult now to convey how completely that word dominated American conversation at the turn of the century. In a single generation, the country had gone from a landscape of small competing firms to one in which sugar, beef, tobacco, steel, whiskey, rope, and oil were each substantially controlled by a single combination. The consolidations were legal, or at least not clearly illegal. The Sherman Act existed but had been used more successfully against labor unions than against capital. Everybody had an opinion. Almost nobody had a fact, because the combinations were private companies which published nothing and answered to no one. McClure, Tarbell, and the managing editor, John Phillips, talked it over on a trip to Switzerland, and the reasoning they arrived at was journalistic rather than political. A general attack on the trusts would produce a general essay, and general essays change nothing. Better to take one company in detail from its origin, with every claim documented, and let the reader draw the conclusion. Which one? The oldest, the largest, the most perfectly organized, and the one that everybody in America already had an opinion about. The assignment was to be 3 articles. It ran to 19, and it took 5 years. The obvious question when the assignment was announced was how it could possibly be done. Standard Oil did not publish accounts. It did not issue statements. It had never given an interview, and its officers had spent 30 years answering questions from state legislatures with a courteous, comprehensive vagueness that had become an art form. There was no archive to consult, no annual report, no role of subsidiaries. The company's own defenders liked to point out, quite truthfully, that critics had been making allegations for a generation and had never produced a document. What Tarbell understood, and this is the whole of her achievement, more than the courage and more than the prose, was that a company which had been sued for 30 years had been leaving a paper trail for 30 years in the one place where it could not control what was written down: the courts. Every proceeding against Standard Oil, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in New York, before state commissions and congressional committees, had produced transcripts, sworn testimony, exhibits, contracts entered into evidence, freight schedules, ledgers subpoenaed and read into the record. Nobody had ever gone through all of it because it was thousands upon thousands of pages of dull procedural print scattered across a dozen jurisdictions, and because reading it required someone who could hold a decade of freight rates in her head And notice when two witnesses in different states had described the same transaction differently. She had an assistant, a young man named John Siddle in Cleveland, and between them they went at it for years. They read the state investigations of the 1870s. They read the Hepburn Committee testimony from New York. They tracked down independent refiners who had been bought out and got them to talk. They found pamphlets that had been printed by the independents in the oil war and then bought up and destroyed. She located one surviving copy in a public library, and the story of that copy she told for the rest of her life. And then there was the matter of the boy in the Ohio office. The account which she gave herself is that a young clerk employed by Standard Oil in the Midwest was told to burn a stack of records, glanced at them first, saw the name of a Sunday school teacher he respected on a list of independent shippers, and understood what he was holding. The papers were reports from the railway freight offices sent to Standard Oil, detailing the shipments of its independent competitors. How much, where to, and to whom. The company was being told, week by week, what every rival was doing by the public carriers those rivals were paying. Rather than burn them, he passed word of them along, and they reached Tarbell. Whether the story happened in precisely that form is impossible to establish now, and she was a writer who knew a good origin when she had one. What is not in dispute is that she published the substance in facsimile with dates and route numbers, and that the company never seriously denied it. She also, extraordinarily, had a source inside the building. Henry Rogers was one of the most powerful men at Standard Oil, a director of the company and the closest thing it had to an operating chief in those years. He was also, it turned out, an oil region man. He had run a small refinery on Oil Creek in the 1860s, a few hundred yards from the shanty where the Tarbells were living, before he was bought out and joined the other side. The introduction was arranged by Mark Twain, whose finances Rogers had rescued and who was a friend to both of them. For 2 years she went to see him. He sent a private carriage. He talked with a candor that has never been fully explained. The usual theory is that he expected a favorable account of an efficient business, and by the time he understood otherwise, he had grown to enjoy the conversations. He confirmed things. He corrected her on dates. He explained, without embarrassment, the logic of the whole enterprise, that no competitor could be allowed to survive anywhere, however small, because a small one might grow. He also told her that he had carried his family's laundry up a path on the far side of the same ravine where she had picked flowers as a child. They worked out that they must have seen each other at a distance before either of them was anybody. The relationship ended, as it had to, when the articles began appearing. She wrote later that she was sorry about it, which one may believe or not. The work itself went on for 5 years, and the least romantic thing about it is the most important. She had an office in New York, and she treated the project as a scholar treats a monograph. Every installment was set in type and then read, line by line, against the underlying documents by a lawyer the magazine employed for the purpose, and the magazine's editors made a rule from which they never departed. Nothing went in that could not be supported by a record a court would accept. It is why the company never sued. It considered it, and its counsel advised against. And the advice was obviously sound. A libel action would have put Standard Oil's own books into a courtroom, which was the one thing 30 years of legal strategy had been designed to prevent. Pressure arrived instead by the routes available to a very large customer. Advertisers were spoken to, a bank made an approach about the magazine's credit, and Tarbell's recorded response to being told about it was that it made no difference to her, which is either courage or a temperament, and in her case appears to have been temperament. There were rumors planted about her private life, of the kind always available for use against an unmarried woman of 45. Old men in the oil region who had agreed to talk stopped answering letters, and one or two who had agreed to be named asked afterwards not to be. She worked through it in the manner of a person doing a job. She was not fearless in any dramatic sense. Her letters from those years describe exhaustion, insomnia, doubts about whether the thing was too long and too dull for anyone to finish. What she had instead of fearlessness was the specific stubbornness of somebody who has laid out all the specimens on the table and can see that they make a pattern and cannot be talked out of the pattern by anybody's opinion of her. The first installment appeared in November 1902 and the last in October 1904. 19 parts. When they were collected the following year, the book ran to 2 volumes and several hundred pages of appendices, most of it documents printed in full so that a reader who did not trust her could check. What is striking about the series, read now, is how little of it is denunciation. It opens with the oil region in the 1860s, described with a fondness that no other writer on the subject has managed, because she had been there. It gives Rockefeller his due at length, and in terms his own biographers have not improved on. The organizational genius, the eye for waste, the nerve, the refusal to be excited by a rising market or frightened by a falling one. She writes that the combination was in many respects a magnificent piece of work. She means it. And then, chapter by chapter, in the flat voice of a person reading out a ledger, she lays the other thing beside it. The rebates with the rates, the drawback on competitors' shipments with the contract, the Cleveland buyouts with the dates and the names of the men and what each of them was paid, the pipeline pressure, the price cutting in one town while prices held in the next until the local rival gave up, the freight reports on independent shippers, the bogus independent companies that were in fact owned by Standard and sold at Standard's direction while advertising themselves as the alternative. She does not need adjectives and largely does not use them. The effect of the thing is cumulative, and it is devastating precisely because it declines to shout. McClure's circulation went past 400,000. Newsstands sold out. The installments were read aloud in offices. The phrase Standard Oil Methods entered the language as a term of abuse, and a country which had suspected something now knew it in detail, with dates. 2 revelations did more than the rest, and neither of them was about money. The first was the surveillance. She printed the freight reports, the routine, clerical, week-by-week accounting of what independent shippers were sending, where and to whom, forwarded by railway employees to a company that was their competitor. Americans who had shrugged at rebates as a matter of business did not shrug at that. It was not an advantage. It was reading someone else's post. The second was the fake competition. She laid out how firms that advertised themselves as independent alternatives, with their own names and their own salesmen and their own price lists, were owned outright by Standard and priced by Standard, so that a grocer in a small town who deliberately chose a local challenger over the giant was buying from the giant and paying whatever the giant wished. This was the discovery that turned the series from an industrial expose into a personal grievance for several million readers, because it meant that the ordinary consumer's one act of resistance had been, all along, part of the machine. The political consequences arrived quickly. Congressional committees sat. State attorneys general brought actions. A president who had built his standing on the trust question read the installments and used them. Standard Oil's response was to say nothing at all in public and a great deal in private. The company commissioned articles from professors of economics and placed them in journals. It circulated a pamphlet to schools and clergymen. It hired, in a piece of history that anyone interested in modern public relations should sit with for a moment, a former newspaperman to manage its image, one of the first corporate press operations in America, brought into being by exactly this series. Rockefeller himself would not be drawn. He had a rule about attacks, and the rule was silence. Engage nothing, answer nothing, wait. His golf partners in those years reported that he was unbothered. His private letters and the recollections of his associates say something different. He referred to her and the family by a nickname that was meant to be dismissive and instead reads as unmistakable irritation, a pun on her surname and the tar barrels of the oil region. To his advisors, he gave a single instruction, and it held for the rest of his life. Not a word about that misguided woman. There is one moment in the whole feud in which the two of them occupied the same room, and it is not a confrontation, which is what makes it the best scene in the story. In the autumn of 1905, with the series finished and the character sketch still to write, Tarbell went to Cleveland with Siddle, and on a Sunday morning they went to the church where Rockefeller was known to attend and sat at the back. He came in and he took his place, and for something over 2 hours she watched him. She had been writing about this man for 5 years and had never seen him. He was 66. He had lost every hair on his head to a condition that had come on in the 1890s, and he wore a small skull cap. He spoke briefly to the congregation about giving. He looked, she thought, older than any man she had ever seen, and profoundly uneasy. She noticed that his eyes moved constantly around the hall, over the doors, over the back rows where she was sitting, as though he were counting the people in the room and did not like the total. He never knew she was there. She went home and wrote the two-part portrait that closed the whole enterprise, and it is the only part of her work on Standard Oil that she was ever seriously criticized for, and the criticism is fair. The character sketch is not evidence. It is a portrait, and it is written by a woman who had spent 5 years inside the documents and had stopped being able to see the man at the far end of them as anything other than the sum of what she had read. She called him the oldest man in the world, a living mummy. She called him money mad. She called him a hypocrite, and she wrote that the national life was poorer and uglier and meaner for the kind of influence he exercised. Some of that is defensible as judgment. The description of his appearance is not. She had taken a physical affliction, a condition that had left a man of 66 without eyebrows or lashes, and used it as a moral illustration. And it is the one passage in her life's work that her admirers have never been able to get comfortable with. She was proud of it at the time. She was less certain later. It also, quite possibly, backfired. Up to that point, she had been unanswerable because she had confined herself to what could be proved. In the sketch, she left the ground she was strong on and went after the man, and it gave the company the only line of defense it had, that this was a personal vendetta by the daughter of a man Standard Oil had ruined. The charge was made at the time, and it is still made. It deserves a straight answer. Her father had indeed been broken by the company. She had indeed grown up in that house. And her book was checked, line by line, by people who wanted very much to find an error in it, and they did not find one that mattered. Not then, not in the century since. Motive is not the same thing as accuracy. She had both, and the second one is what did the damage. That said, the honest version of this story requires two admissions, and the people who admire her tend to skip them. The first is her use of Frank Rockefeller. The great man had a younger brother who had gone into oil alongside him, been squeezed like everybody else, and spent the rest of his life in a state of unappeasable fury about it. A brother who, in an act that tells you everything about the family, eventually had his own children's bodies moved out of the family plot so that they would not lie near their uncle. Frank talked to Tarbell's assistant at length. A source who hates his subject that much is a source to be handled with tongs, and she used him more freely than a modern editor would allow. The second is the case of the widow. In one of the most read installments, she told the story of a Cleveland woman whose husband had died and left her a small works producing lubricating oil. The husband had been a bookkeeper in Rockefeller's own office and a teacher at the same Sunday school. The families knew each other. According to Tarbell, the company took the plant from the widow for a fraction of its worth, and the great philanthropist had cheated a friend's widow while sitting in the same pew. It was the single most damaging passage in the entire series, because it converted an argument about freight rates into a moral fact that any reader could hold in one hand. It is also the passage that is held up worst. Later historians, working from the company's records and from the correspondence of the sale, Ron Chernow's biography is the standard modern account, concluded that the widow had asked a price far above what the plant was worth, that appraisers valued it, and that she was paid a sum well above the appraisal in cash at the time. On that reading, the story Tarbell printed was not merely uncharitable but wrong. Her defenders point out that she had the widow's own account and her own letters and no access whatever to the company's side because the company would not speak to her. That is true, and it is also exactly the objection that any journalist hears from any subject who has refused an interview. According to some accounts, the sale figure was in the region of $79,000. According to others, the widow's original demand had been more than twice that. And the papers on which both claims rest are not, so far as this film has been able to establish, all in one archive. If any of you have access to material that settles the arithmetic of that sale, leave a comment below. The larger judgment, though, has not moved in a century, Chernow, who was severe about her errors, also called her series one of the most brilliant pieces of journalism ever done. Both halves of that sentence are the correct verdict. What the damage amounted to took another 7 years to arrive. In 1906, the federal government filed suit against Standard Oil of New Jersey and its constellation of subsidiaries under the Sherman Act. Theodore Roosevelt's administration did it, and Roosevelt's relationship with the journalists who had made it possible was characteristically complicated. In that same period, he gave a speech comparing them to a figure in Bunyan who rakes the muck at his feet and never looks up. He meant it as a criticism. The people he was criticizing adopted the word within the month, and muckraker has been an honorable title ever since. The trial took 3 years and produced testimony from hundreds of witnesses and tens of thousands of pages of exhibits, a very great deal of which had been mapped out in advance, in public, by a magazine series. In 1909, a federal court in Missouri found against the company. Standard appealed. On the 15th of May, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the ruling. Chief Justice White wrote for the court, established what has been argued about ever since as the rule of reason, that the Sherman Act forbids not every restraint of trade but the unreasonable ones, and gave the largest corporation in the world 6 months to take itself apart. The trust was broken into more than 30 separate companies. The exact number varies between accounts, from 33 to 39, depending on which affiliates are counted and at what date. What is not in dispute is what happened to the pieces. They kept their regional names and their regional markets, and their shares were distributed to the holders of the parent stock in proportion. The largest holder of the parent stock, by a wide margin, was John D. Rockefeller. The shares of the successor companies were separately traded for the first time. The market looked at them, valued them individually, and concluded that they were worth a great deal more apart than they had been together. Within 2 years, his personal fortune had roughly tripled. He became, in the aftermath of the case that was supposed to destroy him, the first dollar billionaire in history, a distinction he owed, in a fairly direct sense, to the woman who had set out to end him. She was not amused. She wrote that the decision was hollow. The pieces went on cooperating informally. The men who had run the combination went on running the pieces, and nobody had gone to prison. She was substantially right about the first 2 things and completely right about the third. And yet, something had changed, and it was larger than a corporate reorganization. Before the series, the secret rebate was ordinary practice, defended openly by serious men on the grounds that a large shipper was entitled to a better price, as any bulk buyer is. After the series, it was indefensible in public, and the machinery that had made it possible, the private freight arrangement, the drawback on a competitor's traffic, the informal understanding between a carrier and its largest customer, was legislated against in stages over the following decade. The stages are worth naming because this is the part that outlasted everybody involved. In 1903, a federal act made the rebate itself a criminal offense for the railway that granted it as well as the shipper who took it. 3 years later, a further act gave the regulators power to fix maximum rates rather than merely to complain about the existing ones, and extended their reach to pipelines, which is to say directly to the choke point the company had moved into when the railways became difficult. The following decade produced a statute specifically prohibiting the practices that the courts had found hardest to reach, and a federal commission whose entire purpose was to watch for them. The rules that govern American business today were, in a real sense, written in reaction to a set of contracts that a magazine writer printed in facsimile. The other change was to journalism itself, and it is the more permanent one. Before Tarbell, an expose was an accusation, usually made by an interested party, generally unaccompanied by evidence, and readers discounted it accordingly. After her, the standard for the form was a documented case, sources named where possible, records reproduced, the other side's best argument stated in full before it is answered. That is now simply what serious reporting means. It was not obvious in 1902. She invented a large part of it in a rented room, working through freight schedules. The people who did it alongside her, Lincoln Steffens on the corruption of city governments, Ray Stannard Baker on the railroads and on race, formed the most consequential group of journalists in American history for a period of about 10 years. And then it ended, as these things do, in an argument about money. McClure's behavior had grown erratic. There were ambitious schemes, a bank and an insurance company, and a textbook business, all to be run out of the magazine. In 1906, the whole senior staff walked out together. Tarbell, Phillips, Steffens, Baker, Siddle raised money, bought a rival publication called the American Magazine, and ran it themselves for 9 years. Tarbell was part owner and associate editor, and if the arrangement produced nothing on the scale of the Standard Oil series, it produced her tariff work, which she thought was better and nobody read. The tariff project deserves a sentence of defense because it shows what she actually was. Import duties are the least glamorous subject in public life and one of the most consequential. They decide, invisibly, who is protected from competition and who pays for the protection. She spent years on it, traveled the country, sat in factories, worked through schedules line by line, and produced a body of reporting which argued that the protective system had become a machine for delivering private advantage under a public justification, which is, if you look at it squarely, exactly the same argument she had made about the railway rebate, transposed into another key. It made no impression at all. There was no villain in it, no widow, no company with a name that made people angry, and the American reading public discovered what every editor since has rediscovered. That structural argument without a face does not travel. She kept going anyway. She served on a presidential conference on unemployment and on the industrial committees of the First Great War, sat on a delegation sent to look at post-war Europe, and lectured in every state of the Union that then existed. She was, by the 1920s, a national institution of the mildly embarrassing kind, the woman who had done the great thing a generation ago, invited to speak and quoted respectfully by people who had not read her since. The younger reformers had by then decided she had gone soft and said so. She was in her 60s, living on a farm in Connecticut with her sister, writing to pay for it, and past the age at which one adjusts one's opinions to keep a following. Her father died in 1905, the year the book came out. She had bought a farm in Connecticut by then and moved her family into it, and she was, at 48, the head of the household in the way that unmarried daughters generally became. And then she did the thing that has puzzled everyone since. At the height of her authority, the most respected woman journalist in America, the writer who had faced down the largest corporation on earth, Ida Tarbell, came out publicly against the women's vote. It was not a passing remark. She wrote a series of essays, collected in 1912 as The Business of Being a Woman, and a second book 3 years later, and she lectured on the theme for years, including to organizations formed specifically to oppose suffrage. Her argument, briefly stated, was that the suffrage campaign belittled the work women actually did, that the household was the essential unit of a decent society and its management a serious profession, and that the vote would not touch any of the things that made women's lives hard. The reaction was ferocious, and it came from precisely the people who had been proudest of her. Suffragists who had held her up as proof of what a woman could do read the essays as a betrayal by the one person whose example refuted her own argument. She had never married, never kept a house, never raised a child, and had built a career of a kind almost no woman of her generation could contemplate. And she was explaining to women that fulfillment lay at home. It is not a position that can be rescued, and this film will not attempt to rescue it, but it is worth understanding because it is of a piece with everything else about her. She was not a radical and had never claimed to be. She was a conservative moralist with an extraordinary tolerance for evidence. She believed in the family, in private enterprise, in the small independent producer, in fair dealing, in doing the work properly. And she opposed anything that seemed to her to break those things, whether it was a railroad rebate or a political campaign that she thought devalued the domestic life she herself had declined to live. Her biographers have suggested, reasonably, that a woman who had spent her life being the exception may have found it easier to defend the rule than to examine what the rule had cost her. She lived another 3 decades and worked through nearly all of them. The later Tarbell is a strange and rather touching figure, and the standard accounts hurry past her. She lectured across the country on the Chautauqua circuit for years, in tents and town halls, and she was good at it and needed the money. She served on government committees on defense and unemployment and industrial relations under 3 presidents. She wrote 8 books about Lincoln, which sold steadily and paid for the farm. She published a novel, Once and Never Again. And she wrote a series of admiring studies of businessmen, the head of the Steel Corporation, an industrialist she considered a model employer, which the younger generation of reformers regarded as an apostasy and which she regarded as consistency. She had never been against business. She had been against cheating. When she found men running large enterprises decently, by her lights, she said so, and she was in her 60s and past caring what the magazines thought. She was diagnosed with tuberculosis in her late 50s and recovered from it. Parkinson's disease arrived later and took the steadiness of her hands. She went on writing more slowly, with help. She was still filing pieces in her 70s. In 1939, at 81, she published her autobiography under a title of characteristic plainness, All in the Day's Work. It is a curious book. It is warm about her parents, exact about the oil region, generous to almost everyone she quarreled with, and evasive about herself in the way that a certain kind of 19th century person is evasive, full of what she did, nearly silent about what she felt. The one subject on which the reticence breaks is her father at that supper table, 70 years earlier, in the winter of the Great Scheme. Her adversary spent those same decades becoming, by a considerable margin, the most successful reputational rescue in the history of American money. Rockefeller had stepped back from active management in the 1890s, though he kept the title of president until the dissolution. The retreat had a physical cause that nobody at the time was told about. In the early 90s, in his early 50s, he broke down, a collapse of the kind that Victorian physicians called nervous exhaustion, and which in his case was severe enough to keep him away from the office for months. In the same period, his hair began to fall out, and then his eyebrows and lashes, and it never came back. The man in the photographs from the 1880s, with the neat mustache and the heavy brows, and the hairless figure of the 90s are hard to accept as the same person. He wore a wig for years, put it aside, and thereafter appeared in a small cap. He took up golf, played it into his 90s with a system of rules devised for his own convenience, and gave the appearance, thereafter, of a retired man. The giving was not retirement. It was a second business, and he built it the way he had built the first. The problem, as he described it, was that the requests had grown past any individual's capacity to judge. Sacks of begging letters, hundreds a day, and no way to tell the deserving from the fraudulent. His solution was to hire a manager. A former Baptist minister named Frederick Gates arrived in the early 90s, went through the applications with the temperament of an auditor, and then turned the whole enterprise around. Instead of answering appeals, they would identify problems and fund the institutions capable of solving them. That single administrative decision is the origin of the modern foundation. A university in Chicago built from nothing into a first-rank institution inside a decade. An institute for medical research in New York at a time when American medicine was barely scientific. A board that put schools across the rural South, and a foundation whose charter was written broadly enough to let its officers spend on whatever the evidence indicated. The public health campaigns funded out of that money, hookworm in the South, yellow fever, the wholesale reform of medical education, saved a number of lives that is genuinely not calculable. He also, in the years immediately after Tarbell's series, became the first great subject of professional public relations. There were newspaper photographs of an old man in a straw hat playing golf. There were tamales handed to children. There was a memoir, published in his 70s, in which the whole history of the company was rendered as a story about efficiency and cooperation, and in which his critics were not named. Both things are true at once, and the family's later history is the same argument continued. That is the difficulty with him, and it is why he is still argued about. It is possible to hold that the fortune was built by methods that a civilized country was right to outlaw, and that the fortune, once built and once given away, did more measurable good than any private money in history. Tarbell could not hold both. Most people cannot. He wanted very much to reach 100. He did not get there. He died at his winter house at Ormond Beach in Florida on the 23rd of May, 1937, at 97 years old, and was buried at Cleveland, in the city where he had been an assistant bookkeeper for $4 a week. He had outlived his wife by 22 years, outlived the trust by 26, and outlived very nearly every man who had testified against it. He had not, however, outlived her. She spent the last winter of her life in a hospital in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a few miles from the farm, having caught pneumonia in December at the age of 86. She died on the 6th of January, 1944, with the second war of her lifetime still going on and the newspapers full of places she had never heard of when she was young. They took her home to Titusville and buried her in the cemetery on the hill, a short walk from the ground where the derricks had stood, in the town where her father had built tanks and mortgaged his house and refused, to the end, to sell. The two of them are worth setting side by side one last time, because the arithmetic of who won is not as simple as either of them would have liked. He won the money. That is not in dispute. The company he built was broken, and the breaking made him richer. The fortune passed intact through a son who had been trained since childhood to conserve it, and it is still 7 generations on in the world. The institutions his money founded are still working. There are laboratories, universities, and public health programs on 3 continents that exist because a bookkeeper from Cleveland decided that the surest defense against being hated was to give the money away faster than the critics could count it. And whatever one thinks of the motive, the results are not imaginary. She won the argument. Every rule that now governs how a dominant firm may treat a smaller one, the prohibition on the secret rebate, the requirement that a carrier charge all shippers alike, the whole apparatus of antitrust that governments across the world have copied and are still arguing about, grew out of a public opinion that she, more than any other single person, assembled out of freight schedules. And every reporter who has since sat down with a stack of documents, rather than a source with a grievance, is working in a form that she made respectable. Neither of them regarded it as a victory. He thought her a misguided woman who had been allowed to slander a decent business, and he never said so publicly, and he was still not saying so at 97. She thought the courts had let him off, that the pieces went on behaving like the whole, that the men responsible were never punished, and that the country had congratulated itself and gone back to sleep. They were both right, which is the ordinary condition of long fights. There is one image at the end of it that stays. A Sunday morning in Cleveland, in the autumn of 1905, an old man at the front of a church, hairless, in a small cap, talking about the duty of giving. An aide rows behind him, unintroduced and unnoticed, a woman of 48 who has read every surviving document he has ever been forced to produce, watching him the way she once watched pond water through a microscope in a college laboratory, not with hatred and not with pity, but with the complete, unhurried attention of somebody who intends to write it all down. He never learned that she had been in the room. She never asked him a single question. Some fortunes, in the end, are remembered less for what they built than for the one person who insisted on describing exactly how it was done.